Last week, I began a study of the kings of Israel. I'm asking, what can we learn from this ancient history? Why it was important enough to put in the Bible? It seems appropriate at this point to look briefly at the actual documents. There are many theories, of course, about the authors and the sources of these books, but there are some hints along the way that are kind of interesting. First of all, remember we are talking about scrolls, great long scrolls. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 6 scrolls. We have recently looked at 1st and 2nd Samuel in my sermons. The tradition is that Samuel wrote the scrolls named for him, but since he died at the beginning of chapter 25 of 1st Samuel, we have to conclude that there was another author that finished them. In fact, many believe that this same writer continued the story right on through Kings, that Samuel and Kings are one long story broken up into 4 scrolls. The last 2 verses of the 1st Chronicles tells us that the sources of the David story come from these places. It says, "Now the acts of King David, from the first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with all his reign, his power, and the circumstances which came on him, on Israel, and on all the kingdoms of the lands." Now, notice that the sources are God's prophets who spoke God's judgment on these kings. It is Samuel who anoints the first 2 kings. It is Nathan who speaks God's condemnation to David when he takes Bathsheba. And it is Gad who was called David's seer because he consulted him constantly for advice. It is also thought that the prophet Jeremiah may have been the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings. He is the prophet in the time right before Judah is carried into exile by the Babylonians, and that story of Kings ends in that event. The point of view of all of these writings is that Israel's kings were under God's supervision through his prophets who represented the covenant of the nation under God. So, these writers were not just courtiers celebrating the deeds of the kings, but they were rendering judgment upon them, as we shall see. I find it interesting that other empires have their court historians, but God's people has prophets as their historians. So, now let me summarize where we are. The 2 scrolls of Samuel begin with the story of Hannah dedicating her little son Samuel to the Lord. Samuel is then acknowledged as God's prophet, and he is the last of the judges. Then the people call for a king to lead them in battle against their enemies, and Saul is anointed by Samuel to be the first king. He is a disappointment, both to Samuel and to the Lord in his disobedience, and God's Spirit leaves him. Then David is anointed king, but there are many years before he takes the throne at the final death of Saul. David reigns for 40 years, And his story ends in the 2nd chapter of 1 Kings, when his son Solomon finally gains full power after a deadly rivalry with his brothers, Absalom and Adonijah. The story of Solomon, then, who reigned for 40 years, if you're interested, from 971 to 931 BC. This story is told in 1 Kings chapter 3 to 11. Solomon is another very interesting man, a great and also a tragic figure. Shakespeare could have written a tragedy about him. He starts out as a humble young person. Imagine what it was like to follow a father like David. We can imagine today the problem of filling the shoes of a powerful and celebrated father, constantly being compared to him. Furthermore, Solomon had to be ruthless in getting rid of men whose loyalty was suspect as a result of the great struggle for kingship at that time. This struggle, might not have been so deadly if David had established his successor and had not been very weak in his old age. So we read that Solomon gets rid of several men, and he appoints his own men in their place, the head of his army and his high priest. We also read of the great cabinet of men that he installs as his officials and his deputies. So Solomon begins his reign with great violence. But we also read of another side of this young man, his spiritual side. To me, this text is one of those to place in my list of great scriptures. My grandfather, a Methodist minister, taught me as a very tiny child to pray for wisdom and understanding. I didn't know what he was talking about, but that's what he told me to do. I'm sure that it is this text which he had in mind. 1 Kings chapter 3. Now, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The king, Solomon, went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Remember, there wasn't any temple at this time. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said to him, "Ask what you wish me to give to you." Then Solomon said, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is today. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, "Because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. As we know, the Lord not only made him wise, but gave him great knowledge of botany and biology and science. He spoke 3,000 proverbs. His fame spread to many nations who sent people to study under him. The other great accomplishment of Solomon was the temple of the Lord. He made a contract with the king of Tyre for wood from the great cedars of Lebanon. He hired stonemasons and carvers. I urge you to take your Bible or the Message and read this very interesting story of the building of the temple. When he was finished with the temple, he called everyone to a great consecration that went on for 2 weeks. The Ark of the Covenant was moved into the Holy of Holies, and then the cloud, the glory of the Lord, filled the house of the Lord. At one point, Solomon stands before the altar and he prays a long, beautiful prayer for the people of Israel. But from there, the story starts downward. He builds a magnificent palace for himself. He marries 700 wives plus 300 concubines. But the real issue is that these women are foreign, and they turn his heart to other foreign idols and gods. To please his wives, he builds altars to the god of Moab and to the god of Ammon. Last week, I read you that prophetic warning which Moses gave to the future kings of Israel in Deuteronomy. It said, "Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. And he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself." This warning cannot be more specific. It is as though God is prophesying through Moses the coming sins of Solomon, including the many horses and chariots which Solomon accumulated for himself. The gold that he received was piled up by the ton. And so the text tells us that Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully as David his father had done. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Because you have done this and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all of the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Now, that servant's name is Jeroboam. He was a valiant warrior in Solomon's army, and he was promoted to a very high rank. There's a prophet called Ahijah that meets this man, Jeroboam, on the road one day, and he gives him a prophecy that God is going to take away 10 of the tribes from Solomon's son and make him king over them. When Solomon dies in 931 BC, his son Rehoboam insists that he is going to continue the very high taxation of the people. And so they revolt. And thus began the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, or what's going to be called the kingdom of Israel, with the 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom, or what's called the kingdom of Judah, which will include the tiny tribe of Benjamin. From this point, we have to keep track of these two kingdoms because the story will be constantly cutting back and forth between the two. To put this into historical perspective, the kingdom of Israel comes to an end in 721 BC. The kingdom of Judah is conquered by Babylon in 606 BC, but is ended in 586 with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The northern 10 tribes are never heard from again. The tribe of Judah is the story that continues as they spend 70 years in exile, and then they return to Jerusalem to rebuild under Ezra and Nehemiah. Solomon's life is similar to many men who start life humbly and are gradually corrupted by their power and wealth. History is full of these stories, and recent events in this country are no exception. But Solomon had a great influence on the Old Testament. The scholars argue, of course, over this, but tradition gives him credit for many of the proverbs in the book of Proverbs. The beautiful love story called Song of Solomon is attributed to him. Ecclesiastes is considered to be Solomon's thoughts as an old and cynical man. It was also, he was also the inspiration for a beautifully spiritual book that appears in the Apocrypha called The Wisdom of Solomon. So his influence and power were awesome, the greatest of the kings of Israel. Jesus himself attests to this greatness. But then he says to us, "Behold, something greater than Solomon is here." Finally, we must contemplate again and again what I call the great if that God repeats constantly to people of the Old Testament. If you will walk in my ways, do what is right in my sight, and observe my commandments, I will be with you. And Jesus gives us the same message. In that last commission, at the end of Matthew, he says that we are to observe all that he commanded us, and he will be with us always, even to the end of the age.